At 78 years old, Benny Andersson no longer cares about fame. He's not chasing headlines. He's not selling reunion tickets. He's not out to rewrite history. But after decades of silence, he finally said something that caught everyone off guard. Because for years, fans believed ABBA ended on a high note, quietly, peacefully, respectfully. But that's not the truth. Not even close. Behind the sequins, beneath the stage lights, and buried inside those perfect melodies, was something broken. Something that even their music couldn't fix. And now, after half a lifetime, Benny's ready to tell us why. But don't expect drama. Don't expect scandal. Expect something far more powerful. Honesty. The kind that only comes from a man who's finally ready to stop pretending. In the mid to late 1970s, there was no one like ABBA. Not the Bee Gees. Not Fleetwood Mac. Not even the Rolling Stones could compete with the worldwide grip ABBA had on music, fashion, and pop culture. They weren't just chart toppers. They were architects of joy, blasting through radios, television screens, dance floors, and living rooms from Sweden to Sydney to San Francisco. And at the heart of it all stood Benny Andersson, the quiet genius behind the keys, the composer who built melodies from emotion, the man who, alongside Björn Ulvaeus, crafted songs that would become eternal. ABBA's music had a strange kind of magic, upbeat but melancholic, catchy but profound. There was always something deeper swimming beneath the sparkle. And maybe that's because ABBA itself was always balancing between joy and sorrow. Fans saw the fairy tale. Two couples, for best friends, making music together. It was a dream, a real-life musical romance. But behind that dream was a reality far more complex. Benny later admitted that the group wasn't as close-knit as the cameras made it seem. Yes, there was love. Yes, there was chemistry. But there was also tension, pressure, burnout. There was never any hate, he once said. But we were four people with very different needs, and we didn't always know how to navigate that. And yet, in public, they made it look effortless. Watch any ABBA performance from the peak of their fame, and you'll see what looks like harmony, literally and emotionally. But Benny knew better. He was holding the group together with music, using melody as glue, even as the people behind the songs began to drift. ABBA didn't just represent Swedish pop, they were perfection incarnate. And perfection, as Benny knew, is the hardest illusion to maintain. He once joked that ABBA's biggest talent wasn't singing. It was smiling when we didn't feel like it. But behind that laugh was a quiet truth. The smiles were real, until they weren't. By 1979, something had changed. The hits kept coming. Chiquitita, Voulez-vous, Gimme, Gimme, Gimme. But behind the scenes, the emotional foundation was starting to crumble. Benny and Frida, once partners in love and music, had begun to grow apart. Björn and Agnetha, too, were drifting into different emotional orbits. It wasn't just personality differences or tour fatigue. It was something more painful, more personal. And yet, the show had to go on. ABBA was now a global phenomenon. Concerts were sold out months in advance. Television specials were booked. Albums were topping charts from Tokyo to Toronto. There was no time for a breakdown, no space for a pause. So they kept going, smiling, posing, performing. And all the while, the personal cracks deepened. Benny would later describe those years as a kind of quiet sadness behind everything. They weren't yelling. They weren't fighting. They were fading. And in a way, that was worse. Because unlike other bands who exploded in drama and destruction, ABBA's unraveling was slow, gentle, almost polite, and that made it harder to stop. Behind the scenes, the four members tried to keep things civil. They were professionals, after all. But Benny confessed that the emotional undercurrents were always present, especially in the music. And that's where it showed the most. Take The Winner Takes It All, for example. Agnetha sang it with so much raw pain that many fans assumed she had written it herself. She hadn't, Björn had, but the heartbreak was real. So real, in fact, that Benny later called it the most honest song we ever recorded. But what about Benny's own heartbreak? He didn't talk about it publicly. He didn't write ballads about it. He didn't cry on camera. Instead, he buried it in chord progressions, layered harmonies, subtle key changes. Because that's what Benny did, he translated emotion into melody. But even the best composers can only hide so much. There came a point when Benny couldn't ignore what was happening. The rehearsals became colder, the studio sessions quieter. The laughter wasn't as easy, the joy wasn't as spontaneous. And that's when he realized something sacred had been lost. "We weren't ABBA anymore," he said in a rare interview. "We were four people pretending to be ABBA." It was a sobering realization, and one he didn't share with anyone, not even the others. Instead, he poured himself into the music, determined to hold it all together a little while longer. But music, no matter how beautiful, can't fix a broken bond. And as Benny would later admit, the songs were the last thing holding us together. But even they started to feel hollow. For Benny Andersson, pain didn't look like chaos. It didn't come in fiery arguments or slammed doors. It came quietly, like a shadow stretching across the piano keys. By 1980, ABBA had already conquered everything there was to conquer: chart dominance, global fame, critical respect. But Benny no longer saw the magic in the music. What once made him feel alive now just made him feel heavy. In interviews, he was still diplomatic, measured, gracious, but behind the scenes, he was unraveling in a way only artists understand. Emotionally, creatively, spiritually. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He was simply sad. Sad that the friendships were fading. Sad that the studio didn't feel like home anymore. Sad that something so extraordinary had become mechanical. Benny spent countless nights alone in his writing room, surrounded by sheet music, old demo tapes, and silence. Sometimes he'd play the opening chords of a new idea, then stop halfway through, unable to finish. He later confessed, "I'd sit there with a melody forming in my head, and suddenly I'd remember a look someone gave me that day, a pause in the conversation, a feeling that maybe we weren't okay, and I'd lose the song." His music, his one true language, had become too emotional to speak. Even worse, he started doubting himself. Was the magic ever real, or had they just been chasing it all along? There's a story Benny once told, offhandedly, without drama, that says everything. During one late recording session, he tried layering harmonies on a new track. It was technically flawless, rich in texture, perfectly composed. But when he played it back, he looked up and realized no one in the room was smiling. Not Frida, not Bjorn, not even himself. And in that moment, he thought, "We're making beautiful music, but there's no joy in it." He didn't say anything. He just saved the tape, packed up, and went home. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't just a bad day in the studio. This was grief. Not the loud, dramatic kind. The quiet kind, the kind that lingers in empty spaces. The kind that doesn't come from failure, but from knowing something beautiful is ending. There was no official announcement, no farewell show, no magazine cover declaring the end of ABBA. Simply stopped. In late 1982, ABBA released the singles. The first 10 years, a compilation album that felt less like a celebration and more like a eulogy. One final new song was included, "The Day Before You Came," and fans noticed something different. It wasn't joyful. It wasn't shimmering. It was haunting, stripped down, melancholic, uncertain. And for those who listened closely, it felt like a goodbye disguised as just another single. Internally, the group was spent. They were still polite, still professional, but the warmth was gone. Rehearsals felt strained. The studio felt hollow. Even interviews were tinged with a strange quietness. There was one moment Benny recalled, a memory that stuck with him for decades. They were standing in the control room, listening to a final mix. The song faded out. The room was silent, and no one said anything. No nods of approval. No jokes. No, "let's do another take." Just silence. "That was the moment I knew," Benny later said. "We weren't a group anymore. We were just four people sharing a memory." And so they drifted. There was no dramatic exit, no public feud, no final curtain call. ABBA didn't end with a bang. It ended with a sigh. Benny walked away quietly, taking only what he needed: his memories, his notebooks, and a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. He turned to other projects, film scores, orchestral work, and eventually musical theater. But no matter what he composed, ABBA was always there. Not in sound, but in spirit. A ghost at the piano. And yet, for years, Benny refused to talk about it. Not because he was bitter, but because he didn't have the words. Or maybe, because it still hurt too much. When asked about the breakup in early interviews, he'd smile politely and say, "It was time." But those who knew him well knew that wasn't the full story. Because time doesn't explain why he didn't touch certain ABBA songs for decades. Time doesn't explain why he'd skip interviews that revisited old footage. And time doesn't explain the look in his eyes when he heard "Slipping Through My Fingers" playing in public. Benny didn't walk away from ABBA because it was over. He walked away because pretending it wasn't had become unbearable. There's something deeply human about that. Most people think bands break up because of ego or money or fights. But sometimes, they end because no one can say what they're really feeling. Because love turns into silence. And silence becomes the only language left. After ABBA faded from the stage, Benny Andersson did what many artists do when the music stops. He disappeared into his work. But this time, the work was different. It wasn't pop hooks or shimmering synths. It wasn't choreographed performances or glossy album covers. It was solitude, reflection, control. Benny poured himself into composing for theater and film, most notably collaborating with Bjorn on Chess, the musical that gave him space to express the emotional complexity he never could under ABBA's bright lights. In Chess, there's a song called Anthem, a slow, aching ballad filled with longing and quiet heartbreak. It's not hard to imagine that Benny saw himself in it. Not the lyrics necessarily, but the weight of it, the loneliness beneath the grandeur. It was exactly what he needed, music with space to breathe. Meanwhile, the world never stopped loving ABBA. Even after their final studio work in 1982, their music never left the airwaves. In fact, it began to grow, taking on new life in karaoke bars, wedding playlists, Broadway stages, and movie screens. For many fans, ABBA remained frozen in time, ageless, timeless, untouched by the emotional messiness that had unraveled the real people behind the band. But Benny didn't live in that nostalgia. He lived in the silence that followed it. He once said, "It's strange, hearing your younger self sing back to you, especially when you know what that young man was trying to avoid." And so, for decades, he avoided it. He turned down most interviews about ABBA. He rarely attended fan events. He politely deflected questions about the breakup. And he never, not once, gave a full explanation for why it ended. Because to explain it would mean reliving it. And reliving it meant reopening something he had fought hard to bury. For Benny, the silence wasn't just absence. It was protection. Protection from the pain of letting go. Protection from the illusion that everything had been perfect. Protection from the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they should have stopped pretending sooner. And then, just recently, something changed. In a quiet sit-down interview, with no glitz, no stage, no agenda, Benny finally said the words he had carried for decades. The interviewer asked him gently what he thought finally ended ABBA. And Benny paused. He didn't reach for a rehearsed answer. He didn't laugh it off or dodge the question. Instead, he leaned forward and said, "We couldn't pretend anymore. Not we got tired. Not we had creative differences. Not even the relationships ended. Just that we couldn't pretend anymore." He explained that the band had become an act, something they performed, not lived. That the love had changed. That the connection had frayed. And that the music, though still beautiful, no longer healed what was broken. He added, "The truth is, we didn't know how to say goodbye, so we just stopped." And then came the line that broke through to fans around the world. "It still hurts, not because of the end itself, but because of what it cost us to keep going for as long as we did." That line hit like a thunderclap, because suddenly the silence made sense. Suddenly the music sounded different. Those upbeat choruses, those bittersweet bridges, those glittering anthems of love and loss, they weren't just songs. They were emotional armor. And Benny, so often seen as the quiet, steady genius behind the band, was finally letting it crack. He admitted that certain ABBA songs still make him emotional, not because of how successful they were, but because of who he was when he wrote them. Sometimes, he said, I hear a melody and I remember the moment we recorded it, not the technical stuff, the looks we exchanged, the silences, the things we didn't say. And in that moment, fans saw something they'd never seen before. Not a pop legend, not a global icon, but a man, just a man, still grieving something beautiful he once had and quietly lost. Benny Andersson didn't give us tabloid headlines. He didn't assign blame. He didn't try to rewrite history. What he gave us was the truth. Quiet, understated, and heartbreaking. The truth that ABBA didn't explode, they eroded. The truth that sometimes, even the most talented, beloved people can't hold on forever. The truth that silence can speak volumes, and that pretending, for too long, can cost you more than you realize. At 78, Benny isn't trying to rebuild ABBA's legacy. He doesn't have to. The songs have already done that. What he's doing is finally letting go of the weight he carried all these years. Because for him, ABBA wasn't just a band. It was love. It was pain. It was everything in between. And when that kind of magic fades, it doesn't vanish. It lingers, in harmonies, in memories, in the silence between notes. And for Benny Andersson, that silence still hurts. For more of the latest news, check out this video.